Are we live?
Yes.
Great. So we're going to do a Q&A today. Thank you for joining us. We've got, 71 people tuning in at the moment. Hopefully it's going to go up. Obviously, we'd want to do a Tyskysour, regular Tyskysour today. We want to bring you all the greatest news, the greatest stories, the greatest chat and banter. But we can't do that because Michael Walker decided to be in a park because the weather's so good. And what's more, he's blaming it on me. He's saying that, I said I'd get in a guest and whatnot. Whatever. Michael can make his excuses. I thought, what the hell? We'll do a Q&A. There's so much going on at the moment. Why hasn't the Prime Minister resigned already? So let's get our teeth into it. So I'll be answering your questions in the comments. Get in there. Ask whatever you like. I've already seen some pretty funny / obscene questions. I'll try and answer as many as is possible whilst remaining polite. Why not subscribe? If you've not clicked that subscribe button, go ahead and do so. Also, there's the bell button just next to it. Get involved on that as well. We do giveaways at the beginning of the show, so if you want to be a part of that, you obviously need to tune in when we go live. So, like I say, hit the subscribe button. What's more, if you are familiar with our work, we've got Navarro FM, our weekly radio show with Resonance 104.4 FM. That's out tomorrow afternoon, 1 p.m. with James Butler. Don't miss it. If you like our articles, if you like our other podcasts and videos, help us build a new media for different politics. Go to support.navarromedia.com, make a one-off donation, make an ongoing subscription, and help us take on the titans in the oligarch-driven print and broadcast media, because nobody else is going to do it for us. We've already had a massive impact in the British media conversation with very, very, very few resources. And frankly, we don't need much to take on some very powerful people, but we need substantially more than what we presently have. So, like I say, help us build that new media for different politics. Go to support.navarromedia.com and help us get there. So let's get on with these questions. Hot weather is socialist. Yeah, that's true. Is it actually? It's a good question. Probably is. We probably would have to engage in some kind of geoengineering in communism to make sure there's no bad weather. Showing his bicep self, not really. I think you can probably see my anterior deltoid. There's certainly no bicep in shot. Hashtag problematic. So what? It's Thursday. Nothing's changed. We got here. It's mostly Syria. Oh, this is a good one. Seriously, though, would like to hear Bastano's take on toxic masculinity. Good question. It exists. It's a real thing. I wouldn't want to define it. I don't think I'm in a position to define it. But I think that people can overplay masculine tropes in order to uphold a sense of self-regard and self-importance. And that's not good. Your bases of individual well-being, how happy you feel in yourself, shouldn't be a result of conforming to a gender norm. I am the way I am because it's who I want to be, who I choose to be. And some people say if you like football or go to the gym, or whatever, that's just ridiculous. That's not, being healthy is not toxic masculinity, right? Okay. So I was sort of joking at that because I think sometimes the left needs to be able to joke at itself. Nevertheless, it still very much exists. Okay. Do you think the Labour Party needs a Peggy Mitchell-like figure to sling John Woodcock, Mike Gapes and Chris Leslie out like the bunch of bar-fighting drunks they are? I was about to get a bit rude there, actually. They do. But actually, it's funny you say that. Mike Gapes looks like a character from EastEnders, doesn't he? If we can pull up a picture of Mike Gapes, or as I like to call him, King Gammon, of the Britanno-Celtic tribe, the Gamoni. They were particularly obsequious to the Romans, of course, once they conquered Britain. These people probably do need to go. What names did you say? John Woodcock, I don't even think the guy's an MP anymore. I think he's a weapons lobbyist. We did some stuff about him a few weeks ago in regard to his connections with Turkey. So he was given a paid trip to talk at the Bosphorus Centre in December, January. The Bosphorus Centre is very well connected to Erdogan's son-in-law, who's also the Turkish oil minister. He himself is very much imbricated in illegal trafficking of oil, smuggling of oil from Iraq and Syria into Turkey, thereby funding ISIS to the tune of about $1 million a day at its height. And of course, the regime in terms of its turn since the coup in 2016, we don't need to highlight that really. We've had about 20 plus people die in prison in Turkey as a result of torture, people connected with the coup. And look, I did a piece about this on Tuesday, I think, for Novara Media. 24 people died in Iran during the protests over the course of the winter. How many people died on the Gaza border these last 2 weeks? These last 3 weeks? It's around the same number, isn't it? And how many people have died in Turkish prisons as a result of torture, this is widely accepted, who were arrested in connection with the coup against Erdogan in 2016? Yeah, like I said, it's the same number as about 20. And yet our government says absolutely nothing about Erdogan, nothing of any substance. Anyway, Boris Johnson's not said anything about goings on in Gaza. And yet we were told at the turn of the year that the Iranian regime was on the brink, that this was a proto-fascist state, that the mullahs had to go. And clearly, I thought it's important to highlight that level of not just inconsistency, but outright hypocrisy in contextualising Britain participating in joint missile strikes over the weekend. Because firstly, Britain can't be an honest broker, or won't be perceived to be an honest broker in the Middle East, as long as it remains this hypocritical. Secondly, nobody, including British citizens, should take these missile strikes as being undertaken in good faith. If you have a government which congratulates General al-Sisi when he wins 97% of the vote, but then they call Putin an autocrat, okay, maybe Putin is an autocrat, but al-Sisi isn't. And Vladimir Putin never killed 600 people in one day of protest. Al-Sisi did precisely that in 2013 when he got rid of an elected government, remember, led by Mohamed Morsi. There were 600 people killed in a single day of protest. That's Egypt's Tiananmen Square. And yet our government says nothing. So Woodcock has to go because he's part of that hypocritical establishment. And the worst thing is, the Tories will say something completely mad. You know, their outriders in the right-wing media and the print press will say something mad. And because John Woodcock, Wally Woodcock, will say the same thing, that means that the BBC or broadcast media or saner voices, more consistent voices, even in the right-wing press, the Times, will carry it. They'll say, look, there are multiple sides using the same line of attack against Jeremy Corbyn. So John Woodcock, I won't say the nickname he's been getting recently. It starts with jihadi. No, he should absolutely go. Because I don't think it's even about a question of political disagreement. The guy is just not, he doesn't deserve to be an MP. He does not, the honourable member for Ankara West does not deserve to be an MP. Chris Leslie, there is no greater gulf in British politics than how clever Chris Leslie thinks he is and how clever he really is. I mean, this is like the Grand Canyon. It's a big gap. And Chris Leslie is one of these unfortunate people who, he is not like Tristram Hunt. You know, Tristram Hunt, of course, was a Labour backbencher, right wing, slated Corbyn consistently, but he was very telegenic, had a good CV. He could waltz off and become the head of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Chris Leslie doesn't have that good luck. And Mike Gapes, well, maybe Mike Gapes could be a high street butcher. But other than that, I can't really see anybody wanting to hire King Gammon. So these three should definitely be, should definitely find careers beyond the Labour Party. But as I've said, maybe apart from John Woodcock, who'd be a wonderful lobbyist for BAE Systems, I doubt any of them actually could. Long answer, I know, but I just thought I had to, go into some detail there. The G in Turkish words represents a break in syllables, pronounced Erdogan. Well, we're in Britain, so I'm going to say it in English. Sorry, my MPC1. Serious question. What do you think we need to do to the City of London and to our foreign development policy to meaningfully break with Ernest Bevin? Have an anti-imperialist government. Okay. Well, I'll briefly answer that randomated. To have an anti-imperialist government doesn't just mean changing foreign policy, although it does, of course, necessitate precisely that. It also means that Britain will have to use its leverage in international institutions to change them. So what do I mean? Clearly, we want reform of the Security Council. We want reform of the UN to democratise it. We want reform of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, so that it moves away from a set of presumptions which says that underdeveloped countries become richer through capital formation and trade. and a certain kind of globalization, which actually the last several decades tell us that's not really true, or where there is an increasing in GDP economic growth, the dividend of that only accrues to a small minority. So the WTO and the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, both need to be changed. Now, this is where I would disagree from some liberals. So liberals would say, oh, the UN Security Council, you've got 5 permanent members, Britain, France, the US, China, Russia, or formerly the Soviet Union. And these big 5 were obviously an outgrowth of the Second World War. They were the victors. And obviously, Britain and France aren't the powers that they once were. They obviously shouldn't be on the Security Council. They must, they shouldn't have a power of veto. You could argue that maybe the US, China, and Russia should. Okay, maybe. But a liberal would say, well, we should reform it, and we should get rid of Britain and have Japan, or have a European Union seat. I don't really care about how representative the Security Council is in terms of what our goal should be. Obviously, I want it to be very representative, but what our goal should be leveraging British institutions, Britain's institutions, its standing, any sort of diplomatic hangover we've got from empire of the Second World War to good effect. We should be arguing for a global transition to renewables. We should be arguing for a different kind of globalization through these institutions using that historic privilege. That makes complete sense to me. So, yeah, in terms of anti-imperialism, yes, foreign policy. Yes, you end expeditionary warfare. You massively reduce military and defense spending. But also we have to have a very, very coherent account of how Britain can change international finance institutions, the IFIs, because we're a major player and we can actually do that. Only a select group of countries can. Right. Superstar Cammy. Cammy is a superstar, as Gary said. Did Gary make Aaron... Can I just say, it's not just Cammy, it's also Georgia. So if you can give a shout out to Georgia and Cammy, that's great. Did Gary make Aaron wear that vest? No? Okay. John Woodcock looks like Jay from The In-Betweeners grew up. I think you can say he looks like Jay from... what were they called? 5. Do you remember Jay from 5? Showing my age now. Chris Leslie invented rotating speaker system? No? Okay. I want some good questions, guys. Thoughts on Vladimir Putin and modern-day Russia? Thank you, Thomas Williams. Tom, he is an autocrat. I think it's probably beyond doubt that he has stolen tens of billions of money from the Russian people. He is the pinnacle of a regime which is kleptocratic, which is illiberal, which, yes, looks out for the national interest of Russia, but only when the national interest of Russia is aligned with the special interest of Russia's oligarch class. So, it's a tough one. On the one hand, the country was veering towards anarchy, breakdown. The state apparatus wasn't particularly effective in the late 1990s. You've got to remember, the largest decline in life expectancy anywhere on Earth in peacetime was Russia after 1989. And I mean, somebody can correct me in the comments, but I think male life expectancy in Russia fell by about 10 years between the late 1980s and the mid-1990s. And I think it was inevitable, really, given that the West mistreated post-Soviet Russia in the way that it did, given that it immediately took advantage of a political breakdown of the USSR to cleave away its various satellite states. Some very much wanted to leave Ukraine. Some didn't. And I think that was a mistake. I think it was a mistake not to respect their sphere of influence. And I think it was a mistake to not have a longer-term solution around how you integrate Russia into the family of democratic nations. But then, of course, there's the tension, isn't it? Because while, yes, Britain and the US are nominal democracies, they don't really want to expand that family of democratic nations when it doesn't suit them. We've seen that time after time. We saw it in Iran in 1953. We've seen it in many places. I talked about the 2013 coup in Egypt. It was an elected government. Mohamed Morsi was an elected president. And yet when he was removed by al-Sisi, the West did nothing. So Putin's not perfect. Russia is not perfect. They have an assertive military policy which is in keeping with Russia's history over the last several hundred years, one could argue. He could certainly be a lot worse. He's nowhere near as belligerent as much of the media make out. People would say, oh, well, they went into Crimea, the war in Georgia. Yes, but this is a country which, bear in mind, had some of the world's biggest stockpiles of chemical, biological, nuclear weapons. And I think it's imperative, actually, for the world system to hold together that Russia's a responsible actor. And clearly villainising them in the way that we have done isn't going to help. In terms of Syria, bear in mind the Russians don't go in there, I believe. I could be wrong. Get in the comments. I don't think the Russians get in there till about 2012, 2013. So you've got a year or two of war. And when the West decided not to intervene in Syria decisively, there is an argument, I think it's quite a compelling one, a morally neutral argument, which says that whether or not it's Russia or the West, whichever side it was, better that the war finished in 7 or 8 years than having a Lebanon-style situation where you have a civil war for 25, 30 years. And I would agree with that. Clearly, an Assad win, maybe you're going to think that's appalling, but I think this is kind of incontrovertible. An Assad win would be preferable, clearly, to an indeterminate civil war which lasts 30 years. That's my thinking anyway. And after the West chose not to decisively intervene, not that I think it should have, but we're sort of having a morally neutral argument here. Once it chose not to do that, then I think, Russia's intervening makes a bit more sense. And actually there are moral arguments for it. Either way, I'm ambivalent, right? I think it's a very messy situation. I think there are very, very few easy answers. But it's clear that by around 2014, 2015, the anti-government forces weren't quite as nice as people were saying. There, of course, have been many mentions of a chemical weapons attack very recently by the regime against rebel forces, but there have been previous chemical weapons attacks by rebel forces. And most notably, I think the Army of Islam, which was one of the groups who were based in Douma, they perpetrated precisely one of those. I think it was a chemical weapons attack, Sarin attack, maybe, on Kurdish forces in 2014-15. There's a UN report out there, and I think it accounts for, at that time, when it was published, I think there were 7 chemical weapons attacks undertaken by the rebels, right? And you'd think this would be aggravating for the international community. You would think, because we were told after 9/11, weren't we? That was the whole thing, 9/11. It's about non-state actors, terrorist organisations, the cost of entry to undertaking terrorist actions or even engaging in warfare. The cost of entry have diminished so lowly, primarily because of reduced cost of information, transactions, coordination, because of the internet, propaganda, is going to transform geopolitics, transform warfare. Now, 17 years later, turns out non-state actors have probably used chemical weapons in Syria, and yet nobody in the media is talking about it. And in terms of British national security, a non-state actor having access to chemical weapons is a far greater threat to Britain. A non-state actor is a far greater threat to Britain than Assad having chemical weapons, because that can be used on the London Underground or in Manchester or in Glasgow. And I'm not saying this lightly. The fact this hasn't happened yet is a minor miracle. These things do exist. They have yet to be used by a non-state actor, except with Syria. Anyway. And so now it's happened there. The question is, how long before somebody tries something similar in the Western Hemisphere or in major cities in the global south, maybe in the region? How long? Who knows? But nobody in our media, at least, is asking these questions. I think they're pretty important. Any thoughts on Northern Ireland? Advice as to engage in aggressive politics here would be appreciated. Johnny? I've never been to Northern Ireland, so I wouldn't want to insult you with my answer. I think the lesson from Corbyn is you need to speak in plain language. You need to ally a vision and big ideas to people's everyday lived experience. And you probably need to be attached to a mainstream extant party. The lesson of Corbynism is that sometimes organisations can be revived as much as replaced. And Labour clearly is a very different organisation to what it was 3-4 years ago. So when I go to Italy and they're saying, who will be our Corbyn? Do we need to start a new party? And I say, well, could it not come through the Partito Democratico, the PD? And I sort of get laughed at, but it could do. I don't have the answers. It could do. So in terms of strategy, I think that's a good thing to remember. Organisations, whether it's electoral, whether it's civil society, there are some great organisations, think tanks out there who are absolutely dog shit right now, but historically have been amazing. I won't name names. There's one involved in carceral reform, prisons, very old organisation, and its impact is zero. And somebody could go in there, spin it up, turn it into an amazing organisation. People don't always have to start their own things. So, I suppose if you're starting an organisation in Northern Ireland, maybe have a think about, could you get involved in something else, which is in the same area, in media production, or maybe around reproductive rights, or whatever you're interested in. Could you join something rather than have to start something yourself? Because as we know in Novara Media, starting something yourself, procuring all the equipment, building your media profile, not easy. So that would be my advice in terms of granular, everyday organising and starting an organisation of some kind. What do you think about Jacob Rees-Mogg? Fine. I want him to be the next Tory leader, although I don't think he will be. I think, like many of the politicians of the right these last few years, given a national platform, he'd be found out very quickly. He is different to the centrists in the Tory party because, a bit like Corbyn, he clearly he motivates, he inspires a good 15-20% of the population, 15% of the population, let's say. The problem is, I think that's got a ceiling on it. Whereas with Corbyn, I don't think it does have a ceiling, because I think Corbyn's shtick is about policies, it's about something bigger than himself. Jacob Rees-Mogg isn't. So he's one answer to the Tories' woes, but I don't think he's the answer. I don't think there is an answer. I think historic centre-right conservatism is going through a crisis from which it won't recover. There's a great line, you've probably heard it before, property-owning democracy. Britain's a property-owning democracy, but we know that property ownership is going down every year. I think property ownership in Britain is at its lowest since 1986. I'll get that up. It's from the FT. You can go Google it. Maybe somebody can put it in the comments. It was an FT article from last winter, I think. Very recent data. So it's the lowest level of home ownership since 86, 87, about 30 years, right? In the US, you're not going to believe this. We've got the lowest level of home ownership since the late 1960s, which is just phenomenal. So clearly, if you are a political project which bases consent on two things, which is what I think the Republican Party and the Tory Party have done, but right-wing politics generally, they've worked on two presumptions. Work pays, you won't be poor if you work, and home ownership is going up. These are the two presumptions which basically underpinned democratic status quo politics for the last 50 years. Both are in reverse, and not just in one country, everywhere. So we know that in the US, 40 million people are still on food stamps. They still require federal assistance to eat every week. In the UK, we know that more people are in poverty, i.e. they're in households where the income of the household is 60% or less of the national average. More people are in that situation where somebody in that household works. Is this the one? Yeah, home ownership, there you go, 30-year decline. More people are in that situation where more people are in households, rather, who are in poverty and work than don't work. So in-work poverty is massively increased in the US and in the UK. Home ownership is going down in the US and the UK. That would appear to indicate that establishment right-wing politics is fucked quite significantly. And to turn that around, I would submit they will have to turn those two trends around. Now, rather than even saying, well, they may do that, actually many right-wingers don't even think this is a problem. It hasn't even registered as something that exists. So, yeah, I'm not really that optimistic for them, which is obviously a good thing for the left politically. What is your opinion of James O'Brien and LBC? I love this. Look, tweet the link. Get this on Twitter. @ James O'Brien. Get him involved. Say, James O'Brien, Aaron's about to trash talk you on YouTube. Get him over here. God. James O'Brien is fascinating because what he does, he always talks about how Donald Trump's always saying, I'm the smartest president there's ever been. I'm so smart. I went to Wharton Business College, which, in fairness, is one of the best business colleges in the US in Pennsylvania. And James O'Brien goes, what an idiot. He thinks he's the smartest president ever. Well, guess what? That's exactly what you do, James. Every single tweet that James O'Brien does is either prevaricating between the left and the right. He somehow is blaming Corbyn for these Windrush immigrants being sent back to various countries in the West Indies. Okay? British people who legally should be here, right? He somehow is blaming Corbyn for this. I have no idea why. And then he's saying, I don't know if you saw this tweet today. Maybe somebody can put it in the comments. He said, if only Corbyn's supporters could deal with anti-Semitism as quickly as they deal with his opponents in the party, it would be gone by mid-afternoon. Well, firstly, racism doesn't work like that, James. New people can become involved, which is what's happened with Labour. It's tripled its membership in the last couple of years. New people, we've got 65 million people in this country. People can post things on social media, so it's never going to be solved, okay? You mug. Yeah, maybe we can scroll down his feed here. You'll see, if you can get the one about the anti-Semitism, that'd be great. Whatever. Looking for it? Yeah, whatever. I mean, but anyway, the guy's pitch is that he's smarter than everyone else. James O'Brien, you're just like Donald Trump. You're the man you hate more than anybody. But you're a liberal. Okay, so he's like a liberal Donald Trump. He prevaricates between left and right. He thinks that politics as a category doesn't really exist. And his ideology boils down to a single line. I think I'm cleverer than everyone else. That's his politics. And what happens is you have this bizarre milieu online who gravitate around him and other influencers, sort of centrist male influencers, who think the same thing. And they all think that they're cleverer than everybody else, if only everybody was as clever as us. And this is all they seem to say. Meanwhile, the politics of this country, 80% of the politics of this country, we see that in the last general election, Tories get 40%, Labour get 40%, is being grabbed by the right and the left. It's being massively polarised. And rather than actually participating in that conversation, rather than trying to set a proper agenda, rather than making demands, rather than advancing a programme for national change, James O'Brien just goes on LBC every day and just goes, I'm cleverer than everybody else. Isn't that amazing? Imagine if the clever people were in government. Well, James, like I say, you sound just like Donald Trump. So that's my thinking around James O'Brien. Okay. Aaron, why did you fall in line with MSM agreeing there was an anti-Semitism problem? There was. I mean, this is the thing. I've had people say that to me on my Facebook, page. And people say, Aaron, this is the LED lights, by the way. My God. It's like being in Italy. I've had people say, Aaron, why are you highlighting this issue? Yeah, it's a thing, but, we shouldn't talk about it because it's bad. Look, if this was black people, or if this was Islamophobia, would you dream of saying that? Really? Of course you wouldn't. So it's unacceptable. And yes, clearly there are people who leverage it for political gain. And I'm not talking here about Labour MPs, I'm talking about the Tories. Because that's what politics is about. And I've had some melts, again, say, oh my God, how could you say that? Well, of course the Tories are going to use this. Of course they are. Because Labour is perceived to be weak on it, and there's a modicum of truth to it. There's also more than a modicum of truth, that Tories are anti-Semitic. We know, for instance, that the Tories have a partner organisation, the EU, Fidesz, an anti-Semitic party in Hungary. Fundamentally, it's a far more dangerous relationship that they have with that party than what's going on in Labour. Sure, I agree. But I don't think it's, the Tories aren't our problem. And it only makes our argument more powerful in highlighting it if we don't have these issues. And I don't think that, the things that have been said around this, if it was, like I say, a black person or a Muslim, people wouldn't just disregard these claims. Anti-Semitism and anti-Zionist behaviour have been confused in the media to polarise the long-term effects. LBC is a nightmare. Can be great, but it's mostly a nightmare. The best thing about LBC is the callers, is the everyday people. And I would love Novara Media to go into that kind of genre of media, because you get people saying great stuff. It serves two purposes. The first is you know where people are at, okay? You don't need to read a muppet like Matthew Dancona to ventriloquise Tory voters. You can hear them say what they think in real time, responding to things. So it has that purpose. But then secondly, so you know what people are thinking. But secondly, you can also persuade. And I think I've heard people have conversations on Talk Radio or LBC, and they're persuaded. And they're really interesting spaces for conversation and deliberation. So I would love Novara Media to have a Novara Talk. Drive by with Bastani. We can't do that unless we have more resources, unless you go to support.novaramedia.com. But LBC is great. The presenters, however, are terrible. There's a reason why. They have a right-wing agenda. Let's look at the balance. Nigel Farage, Nick Ferrari, who's the liberal guy? James O'Brien, the other guy, the guy that was with Tom Robinson, the Pakistani British guy. I can't remember his name. But the point is, and he's a liberal, right? Again, it's about Majid Nawaz. It's about, I haven't had my coffee this evening, don't worry. And we're having a conversation before this, it's too late to drink coffee. You're probably right, it is, right? It's 8:45. There's clearly no political balance there. And that's because it's got a sort of political project underpinning it. Ian Dale. And they don't want smart, intelligent commentary. Doesn't even have to be left-wing, okay? Get Sian Berry on there. She's a Green. I mean, she's left-wing as well, but she's not Labour. She's not, a communist. Why can't you do that? They can't do that because then, of course, the consent which they work so hard to build around a certain set of presumptions and ideas, well, they'd become unravelled very quickly because even with this rigged media in their favour, 40% of people just voted for Jeremy Corbyn. In Scotland, almost a majority of people, 45%, not bad, right? In 2014, voted for independence in spite of the mainstream media. So, of course, they're not going to change their roster. Of course, they're not going to change their lineup, even if it hits their bottom line. We see that with The Guardian, right? The Guardian is prioritising a political line. Clearly, they have different incentives. Clearly, The Guardian's a lot better politically than LBC. They are prioritising a certain political line. Forget politics. Over sales, right? The Observer is terrible. The Observer is a terrible, terrible, terrible newspaper. I buy it on Sunday because it looks great. And I want to know, it sets the broadcast agenda. So the big stories on a Sunday, the Observer's helping set them. Okay, that's really its main role. Nobody actually reads it, right? But it's terrible. And you think the Observer could have massively increased sales, or at least it could stop the rot if it had different kinds of scoops, covering different kind of stuff, change the comment section. That's the cheapest, easiest thing to do. Andrew Rawnsley, you kidding me? Andrew Rawnsley's not been in touch with what's going on the left for 25 years. So of course he can't cover Corbyn properly. So even where there are organisations with business incentives to cover what's going on properly, they're not doing it. So I almost feel like Britain is being held hostage to a very bizarre media ecology right now. That's not to write The Guardian off. I spoke earlier on about reviving as much as replacing organisations. I think we can do that with The Guardian. I think we can do that with The Observer. I think we can do that with the Daily Mirror. That's another one. I mean, the Daily Mirror, its sales have fallen 20% year on year in the last year. The Daily Mirror, okay? There's been a reanimation of Labour as a political party. The Daily Mirror in 2010 was the only paper to back Labour, the only one. And yet their sales, as Labour's electoral performance rockets, biggest increase in the share of the vote for any party since 1945, as that happens, their sales fall even further. So what's going on? Clearly the inference is they're not taking the opportunity that's available to them. I mean, it's shit. There's nothing worth reading in the Daily Mirror. There's the occasional good thing. This should be the paper of the Corbyn voter. It should be challenging, it should be left populist, it should be anti-establishment, but more than what you see online or what you see with certain, blogs or whatever, it should have an aspect of real, rigorous journalistic integrity to it because they have money, okay? They can have foreign correspondents. And I think, what a shame. What a shame. So little value journalistically, politically, is in the Daily Mirror when it could be otherwise. But anyway, let's hope we can revive it. Nick Cohen. Nick Cohen. Can you imagine this guy, Nick Cohen? Come on, guys, more questions. Communists on LBC now. I couldn't agree more. Always by the Morning Star. Well, look, we're going to disagree with this, right? Because I love the Morning Star, but it's a daily print newspaper. And I actually think the market for daily print papers is in decline. I think it's in a secular decline. I think people now, when they want daily information, they're not going to buy a printed product. And these publications are they're in suspended animation. Okay, it's a matter of time, I think, generally. Their digital platform is obviously something different. So when I say I want to save the Mirror, I think that's what you'd be saving. But daily print is on the way out, Weekly, monthly print. So all the daily papers are going down. The Times, the Guardian, the Daily Mirror, the Sun. The Sun is no longer the most read daily paper. How funny is that? I think it was overtaken by Metro. They're all going down, but then weekly and monthly publications, the New Statesman, Prospect, across the political spectrum, LRB, Spectator, The Economist, all going up. So clearly something is happening in regards to people's spending habits in terms of their media consumption. They're probably so subsumed within a world of notifications and screens that this kind of tactile experience of print media is very appealing, but not every day. And I think that's where we're going. So the left needs to invest in rigorous, journalistically coherent and concise stuff on a daily basis. It'll have to be online, ultimately, I think. And then the longer term, the longer form stuff, weekly, monthly, in print, yes. Which it presents challenges to the Morning Star. So they're going to have to really focus on their online offer, I think, in the medium term. He's close to getting sweat in his eye. Could swim on his forehead. Well, guys, I mean, is that racist? Is that racist? You know, maybe I'm sweating more because, you know, I'm a person of Middle East origin. I'll leave that to you. It does look like a sauna, doesn't it? I'm just looking at myself now. Wow. It's amazing. I actually don't feel that bad. Maybe it's the... Well, what's that? It's the lighting. It is the lighting. We're going to have to work out something here. What we did was this backdrop here, which is yet to be covered up. The heating was never turned off. So the heating is on, and it's 25 degrees outside. So this probably is bordering on like entry-level sauna. Is the Commonwealth an anachronism? Yes. Get rid of it. Now. No. I'm going to answer one more question after that to get them in. The Commonwealth, I think, again, it's terrible. It's a legacy of colonialism, empire, etc. If we were going to talk about reparations, if we were going to talk about a different kind of globalization, a different set of trade dynamics for the Global South, would that be one way of starting, catalysing the conversation before taking it up to the level of the UN, the WTO, the IMF? Potentially. And that wouldn't necessarily be, Britain looking down at the other economies, right? You've still got some very big players there. Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. I mean, India's economy is bigger than Britain's on a price purchasing parity basis. So I think purely because you've got other big players in there, you've got Australia, if we were to talk about some kind of a deal with its indigenous population. Same with Canada. There could be something in it. But again, it's contingent on the politics of the left and what happens in the next 10 years as Corbyn comes to power. And there's a Labour government. Have you been invited to the royal wedding? Here we go, look. Didn't mean to insult you, Aaron. I was just trying to normalise the practical use of towels during a good session. That's true. I should have a towel for next time. I've not been invited to the royal wedding. My view is Harry is a lovely guy. He's not a lovely guy. He's probably racist when he made those comments about his colleagues being ragheads a few years ago. He probably isn't racist, right? His partner's mixed race. Harry is clearly liked more than William. Prince Charles, nobody likes him. But he comes across as okay. He comes across as personable. I want him to be a happy personal, have a happy personal life as a private citizen. I don't think he should be a monarch. I don't think he wants to be a monarch. I don't think that kind of pressure fused with celebrity culture could be very healthy for somebody in their position, as we found out with Diana, tragically, in 1997, I believe it was. So I think for the sake and the benefit of Britain, but also for the House of Windsor, we should become a republic. That said, I wish them all the best in their wedding. And I hope they stay together a very long time. Invictus. Harry is just trapped in a system. End the system. Well, Marx is a very interesting thing about capitalists. And I believe this, or I agree with this to an extent. He says that they are as much subjected to a set of dynamics as anybody else, right? Which is to say that in capitalism, the fundamental logic is competition between capitalists. Now, it's this competition, and if, of course, you don't compete, you go out of business, and then the worst thing of all happens is you're no longer a capitalist, you're a worker, which is horrible, because you have to work. They're in competition with one another. This drives down overheads. It means that they create new innovations in production, new consumer innovations. It means productivity goes up, which has broadly created massive rise in living standards across the global north and more recently the global south, right, over the last 200 years. But if they don't compete, then they're screwed. So yes, in a sense, they are just as much subjected to a set of dynamics, a system, as the workers. The only difference being, of course, that their life isn't shit under capitalism. Although they can't really opt out. Very much agree. It's just as much the matrix for them as it is for us. Except they probably aren't in that kind of weird uteral gel, okay? They're more or less having a nice time. Do you know what eyebrows are for? Hey, look, I've got big eyebrows and they're not doing the job, which is probably a credit to our LED lights. Can you please explain Lexit? I'll answer that because it's a good question, actually. Republic, yes, yada, yada, yada. Okay, Lexit, last one. Good. Lexit, of course, is abbreviated left Brexit. There was some claim a left argument for Britain leaving the EU. I was one of them saying that in 2016. I still believe many aspects of it. I changed my mind shortly before the vote because I thought two things were going on. Firstly, the distinction between the EEA being in the single market and not being in the EEA wasn't very clear. It actually been made very, very ambiguous, and we're now finding out that was true. Secondly, I thought that the EU would really punish us if we didn't stay in the single market. We'd be, colossally hurt economically, which I also think is going to happen. Now, I thought those two trends were going to unfold within the context of a right-wing shift in British politics, okay, which is what, 2015 UKIP got 4 million votes. So I think my change of mind is reasonable, was reasonable. However, I also think that it's been proven incorrect in so much as the Brexit vote was not a vote for UKIP, and it was not a vote for the right. It was for some people, but not universally. Not universally. I think the vote for Brexit was just as much putting two fingers up to the establishment, just as much about taking back control. And the taking back control thing, the left hasn't really had an account for sovereignty for a very long time. And this country, until 2016. Sovereignty, the idea of self-government, was almost like we were just giving it to the far right, which is terrible because the concept of self-government is clearly intrinsic to the concept of democracy. So if you're not up for self-government, you're not up for democracy. And I actually think a large subsection of the electorate understood that, and they grasped that, and they responded to it. Now, clear in London, where people go to other parts of the country, like John Harris, like a safari park, they think they're going to Marwell Zoo, they wouldn't get that. Or maybe they do. Actually, I'll give John Harris some credit. More recently, he's got it. But generally, I don't think they got it. So that was the argument for left Brexit. My view is that the programme Corbyn has for government could not be delivered inside the EU. And I believe a deal will be made between the government and between the European Union, which says that we will be able to leave the single market, get a pretty good deal on, borderless trade, frictionless trade, get a pretty good deal on migration, not be able to negotiate our own trade externally, which of course is a function held by the undemocratic European Commission, which is terrible. And in return, we'll not be able to move beyond a certain space in terms of policy. So we won't be able to move tax up beyond a certain threshold. We won't be able to spend more or less on X. We won't be able to opt out of certain things. Now, people are saying, and so I think that's going to limit a Corbyn government. And that's not about should we leave the EU or not. That's about what's going to happen next. And people are saying, well, the EU's never been an agent of privatisation. It's just not true. There are cases about this. It's an EU law. I could go into it. I've gone into it many times. There's the Laval case. There's the Viking case. If you put Laval, Viking, EU, there are clearly cases for the EU driving legislation which weakens domestic labour forces. There has clearly been an EU agenda on privatisation in regards to creating a single market. You can't have it, and this is the single market. It's called the single market because it's a single market. So the single market requires you have harmony between 28 member states in regards to the kinds of things they can do to assist their own industries and inhibit external industries, right, or external actors coming in. So Britain's now leaving the EU. It's making life very difficult for Strasbourg and Brussels. They're probably going to give us quite a bad deal on that. So leaving the EU made sense, I think, in terms of delivering the Corbyn prospectus, but it's also made it possibly more difficult, which I know is a very enigmatic answer, but there you go. So on balance, I still don't really know. There's a great line by Zhu Enlai. He was a former Chinese statesman, and he was asked, what do you think about the French Revolution? And he said, it's too soon to tell. And I think we probably need to say the same thing about Brexit. But what do I think about Brexit or the possibility of Lexit? It's too soon to tell. We'll know in 5-10 years. And on that note, you've been great. I want to do this more, but my God, we're going to have to get some air conditioning first. We'll be back on Monday with Tyskysour. Michael Walker will be in then. He won't be on the beach or in the park. Check out James Butler on Novara FM tomorrow 1 p.m. on the Novara Media website and on Resonance 104.4 FM. My name's Aaron Bastani. Subscribe, hit that bell button, go donate, because we need a new media for a different politics. Goodbye. That was Macho Man, by the way.